everybody. Welcome today. I am going to give the room a little bit of time for it to fill up, so we'll probably pop back in another minute or two. So please give us just a few moments while that room fills up. And Cooper, Sai, you can see our deck, right? And just our deck, not my messy desktop or Slack. Great. That's what I wanted to hear. All right, I still see numbers kind of trickling in there, so we'll give it just another minute or two before we get started. All right, what do you think, Sai? You ready to kick us off?
I am indeed.
Great.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Liz. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. Today we'll be talking a bit about cannabis demographics, particularly how the consumer landscape has changed. And I think there's some interesting things about the cannabis industry. The landscape is constantly changing. New markets are opening up. New consumers are coming into the category. And then we're in the midst of a pandemic, unfortunately, still a year on for us. We just had our 1-year anniversary from going to fully remote. So I'm sure many of you are in the same camp, but that also changes, the demographic landscape as well. So it's really important, and I think quite an interesting topic, and we've got some great data to share today on this. Demographics can be important to really, understand your target audience, compare with your, expectations, and, do those things come together? Better understanding your brand positioning when it comes to your consumer also helps you with, how you're marketing, and ultimately just staying ahead of the curve. So on today's agenda, we'll talk a little bit about Headset, and I'll introduce the organization for those that might not be familiar. And then we'll be walking through the consumer landscape and how to apply demographic insights. I'd like to introduce Liz, our Director of Analytics, Cooper, our data analyst, and myself, co-founder and CEO of Headset. So at Headset, we provide a variety of market intelligence and business intelligence services for the cannabis industry. Headset Insights is primarily what we're going to be discussing today. It's our market intelligence product with a demographics component as well. It's based on our integrations at retailers and dispensaries, primarily with their systems of record, which is most often their point of sale. We've processed over $15 or $14 billion worth of transactions. So we've got a really sizable data set that we'll be going through today, and a lot of consumer information in there as well. We also provide a variety of services specific to retailers and dispensaries, as well as services like Bridge, which provide a direct data access to enable services like vendor managed inventory. So all data, all cannabis, but today we'll be really talking a lot about the Insights product. And speaking of Insights, we have our Insights Premium module. We also have Insights Pulse, which is free for everyone to sign up. I encourage everyone to do so. If they don't have an account, you can go to headset.io and sign up for our Insights Pulse, which gives you a high-level market overview in the markets where we have our projections. And today, for the webinar, we'll be talking about the demographics component, and that comes with the demographics add-on, so you'll get kind of a sneak peek into how that works. Some learnings that we see, from that data, and it's pretty powerful. Our demographics data, again, is built on the systems of record, so loyalty programs coming out of retailers and dispensaries. It's actually based on 9.3 million customer records, so customers in the system that have transactions associated that we're able to pull, demographics data like gender, and generation, which will be, in this presentation. So very, very rich set of data, and it's all coming from the point of sale loyalty. So we actually know what's happening. It's very different than a lot of demographic type information you might hear elsewhere, which is often self-reported, built on things like consumer surveys or consumer panels. And the way to think about that is, maybe you go to the grocery store, and one way to find out, what that person purchased is to ask them. You had a whole basket. What were the things that you bought? And they may remember some of it, may remember or not remember others. And another way to measure is to really just look at the receipt. And you can look at line by line and see actually what they purchased. And so with Headset, we're looking at the receipt. So we know exactly, what that consumer purchased and who that consumer is. And that all feeds into the type of data that we'll be covering today. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Cooper, I believe, to kick us off.
I'm going to actually just quickly baseline us before we get going too far. So Cooper has some really excellent insights about genders and generations and kind of how they consume cannabis products. But before we go too far, what I wanted to do was walk you through what those generations are and give you some definitions. So at Headset, we use the generational definitions maintained by the Pew Research Center. So going from oldest to youngest, we'll start with the silent generation. These individuals were born during the Great Depression up into about the start of World War II. Individuals in this generation are aged 75 to 93. And this demographic group is marked by their childhood taking place during the Great Depression, which left them more frugal than other groups. This generation is shrinking in size as the median life expectancy in the US is 78, and the youngest group here is 75. The next generation is baby boomers, so named because they were born during the baby boom that followed the end of World War II. Individuals in this generation are 57 to 75 years old. This generation is known for the increasing prosperity during which they grew up, as well as for coming of age during the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, which birthed the nickname the flower power or flower children generation. So that was one of the names that was floated for baby boomers before they picked the name baby boomers. This group of individuals is nearing or in retirement. So next we'll look at Generation X. Individuals in this generation were born between 1965 and 1980. They were often named or deemed latchkey kids. Gen Xers were considered the first daycare generation because many were raised by two parents who worked or by a single divorced parent. This generation delayed marriage and childbearing to focus on developing themselves first, and they were one of the first generations to report heavily valuing work-life balance. Next, we'll talk about the generation that everybody loves to talk about, millennials, whether it's our avocado toast, our side parts, or our killing of various industries. Millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. If you're doing your math right, that means millennials started turning 40 just this year. This is one of the generations that's most studied, and they came of age during the new millennium. Most in this generation do not remember a time before computers were a common home staple. The generation was raised by less authoritative parents and had access to the internet for most of their lives. This group is known for their tech-savvy lifestyle and delayed entry into traditional adult milestones like getting married or buying a house or starting a family. An interesting fact is, as of last year, millennials overtook baby boomers as the largest generational group in America, with the US Census Bureau reporting 73 million millennials in America compared to 72 million baby boomers. In addition, projections show that Generation Z will be larger than baby boomers in less than 10 years. So 2028 is about that inflection point where we'll think that Generation Z will be a larger group than baby boomers. So this leads us to Gen Z. This generation was born between 97 and 2012. The oldest in this generation is 24 years old this year. This generation was born during a time when most households had broadband internet. They likely don't remember a time before smartphones. Interestingly, when you look at those ages again, a lot of people in this generation were in their teens when cannabis was legalized for adult use in the states that they lived in. Generation Z is known for their independence and their concerns about the environment. This generation represents the biggest source of growth for cannabis as they age into the marketplace. In the state of California, even the oldest individuals in Gen Z were born after the legalization of medical cannabis in 1996. And as this generation ages into the marketplace, brands need to consider some of their unique characteristics, which we'll talk about today. But to get you started, I'm going to have Cooper talk to you a little bit about how these generations break down in the market.
Thanks, Liz. So as Liz mentioned, I'm going to be looking at demographic trends over the last 2 years, starting pretty broad at a kind of market level, total market level, and then drilling down into more individual customer groups, individual markets, and product categories. And then I'm going to pass it back to Liz, who's going to give us an even more detailed view of how different types of customers respond to different brands, which is a very fun analysis to look forward to. And so I'm starting by taking just a market-wide look at total sales by gender. And I have a couple graphs in a row that have this general format. And so we've got total sales on the axis on the left and year-over-year growth on the axis on the right. And then the dark purple bars are sales in 2019. The lighter purple bars are sales in 2020. And that line up above is the year-over-year growth between the two groups. So here immediately we can see that male customers spend more on cannabis than female customers, and it's slightly more than 2/3 of total recreational cannabis sales go to male customers. However, sales to female customers grew more between 2019 and 2020. So the female sales grew by 43%, whereas male sales grew only by 37%. And so that, of course, if the year-over-year growth is higher for females than males, that means that their market share increased. And so we saw female market share increase from 31% in 2019 to 32% in 2020. And I think it's a pretty safe assumption to make that female customers will make up at least 1/3 of total recreational cannabis sales by the end of this year. So next, I'm going to switch to age group data. Same type of graph, just now we're splitting it by those generations Liz just defined for us. So here, I love this graph. We can see a really nice, clear trend line in year-over-year growth. As we move through the generations from youngest to oldest, the year-over-year growth decreases. We do see that all age groups except the oldest silent generation had positive year-over-year growth. So everybody grew during 2020. However, Gen Z really stands out. That customer segment has new customers aging into the market every day by having their 21st birthday, and they grew their sales by a whopping 127%, so more than doubled 2019 to 2020. And we expect this growth trend to continue, of course, as there are going to just be more and more eligible customers, and they're only going to become a more important customer segment over time. Then this decreasing growth trend as age increases, we can kind of hypothesize a little bit about that. I think one of the clear explanations, especially during a contagious viral pandemic, is that we may be seeing some different age groups place cannabis at a different level of importance within their lives. So younger customers may see it more as an integral part of their lives, whereas older customers who are less likely to want to risk exposure to the coronavirus may have seen it more as a luxury or an occasional purchase. So that might be why we see this decreasing trend line. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so here we've looked at gender at a market-wide level. We've looked at age groups. Now we're putting them together and looking at individual demographic groups and year-over-year growth 2019 to 2020. So again, we have a really nice, lovely trend line moving from left to right. Year-over-year growth decreases as age increases, and within each generation, female customers had higher growth than male customers. We saw that at a market level. Now we can see that that bears out even when we drill down to within each of these age groups. And I will just point out there that Gen Z females were by far the fastest growing demographic group last year. Okay, so now we're shifting gears a little bit here, and we're going to compare the 2019 and 2020 category wallet share of two different age groups who had very similar 2020 sales totals, right about $1 billion. And so that's Gen Z up on the top two bars and baby boomers, the bottom two bars. And here at Headset, we've done a lot of reporting on how consumer preference has shifted through COVID-19, but it's really important to realize that a lot of those trends that we report on are for an entire customer base, either multiple states or within a single state. And here, this really goes to show how important it is to look at individual customer segments within those markets, because we can see really clearly that different types of customers purchase different types of products at different ratios, and those different types of customers are trending towards and away from different categories. So for example, we over on the right side of the graph, we can see that light gray bar is market share to vapor pens. And so we can see that Gen Z customers are consistently spending much more of their total spend on vapes than baby boomers, which isn't too much of a surprise. But what may be a little bit more surprising is the kind of different direction in the year-over-year trend. Gen Z customers increased their spend from 2019 to 2020, whereas baby boomers pretty significantly decreased theirs from about 19% to about 14%. Okay, and now we're going to drill into Gen Z specifically because they are one of the more important age groups to take a look at and keep your eye on. And so we can see that the year-over-year category trends are going to be not only different between age groups, but going to be different within an individual age group between genders. So we can see that if we'll start on the left-hand side of the graph here, looking at flower, the biggest category, we can see that neither gender had a big shift, but females did slightly increase their flower spend, whereas males slightly decreased theirs. So we see some opposition there. Both genders increased their wallet share to vapor pens, which is not surprising from the last graph, but male customers had a larger jump from 24.2% to 25.9% in 2020. And then female customers, we're looking at concentrates now, the lightest purple there. They had a slight decrease in their relative concentrate share, but males had a really significant increase from about 11% to 16%. And then if we move one color to the right, looking at that dark teal, we can see that male customers had a pretty a significant decrease in their pre-roll spend. So it would appear that Gen Z male customers between 2019 and 2020 did some pretty significant substitution concentrates for pre-rolls during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And then now I want to, we've looked at a wide market level. We've looked at some individual age groups, and then we've drilled into one age group in particular. Now I want to just look at Gen Z female customers across different markets, because while we all hope, I think, that we're moving towards a federally legalized cannabis industry where there will be less and less nuances between markets, there are still right now between state markets some pretty significant differences. And so it's important to not only understand what your customer is doing at large, but also specific to your the playing field that you play in. And so I think we can see some pretty amazing differences here, especially in California. Again, looking at vapor pens, Gen Z females had 32.2% share in 2020, almost as much share as the king of categories, flower, over there with 35.7%. And then we can see another pretty big difference in edibles, that dark teal on the left-hand side of the graph. Gen Z females in Colorado spent relatively, twice as much on edibles than Gen Z females did in Washington. Okay. And so for my final graph, I just wanted to, again, shift focus from looking at different markets to now just focusing on one category, vapor pens, which I've mentioned a few times now because it has some fairly interesting trends within it. And so if you're a vapor pen brand, which Liz is going to speak more directly to in just a moment, it's important to not only understand, how the market at large is performing, what's growing and what's not, but also where that growth is coming from, who is driving that growth. And I think we can see here on this graph where we're again looking at 2019 versus 2020 sales growth by demographic group, that if you're a vape pen brand, your growth in 2020 was largely driven by your youngest customers. So there on the left, Gen Z had, again, more than twice the spend in 2020 than they did in 2019 on vapes. Millennials had pretty strong growth, 36% for females and 26% for males. I think Gen X is pretty interesting. Female customers having nearly 20% growth, whereas male customers have 3% growth. So just barely positive there. And then we actually see that baby boomers, it's not that they just didn't keep up with the growth of the market. They actually had true contraction within this category. They spent 20% less on vapor pens in 2020 than 2019. So that just goes to show it's critical to know who your customer is, and so that you can use these type of data to drive your business decisions. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Liz, who's going to walk us further through this analysis.
Thanks, Cooper. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about, so Cooper sort of stated that high level where we talked about consumers in all of cannabis and then looking a bit into vapor pens. I'm going to get into brand positioning and how that affects the demographics that do purchase a type of brand. So to get started, I want to point out 2 California brands just for us to look at here. I just snipped these straight from their website. So the one on top is a brand called Plug and Play. They are a brand of proprietary vapor pens. So you see, first of all, this kind of dipped in color. If you do go to their website, you'll see that they have a line that's called DNA. Daytime, nighttime, anytime is kind of how they're branding their strains. They also have a line of exotics, which are flavored. So this is sort of their website. When we see it, it's a lot of splashy. There's like the really pretty oil in the pictures. Below that, we see Dime Bag, right? So this, like immediately looking at this branding, we can kind of understand who they're going after, especially that like second picture there, right? We know those aren't skinny jeans. Those are the jeans that Gen Z loves. So these are 2 very different brands in California, but let me contrast them with a couple other major brands that make vapor pens. So one is Dosist. So Dosist markets their products almost exclusively as an effect base. So they've got a relax line, an arouse line, and a bliss line. What's interesting is when you go to their website, there's a big section to kind of learn. And a similar brand there is ABX down below. So when you go to their website, there's actually even a place to learn how to vape. So they market their products. They give a lot of information about the strain, but you can see how differently branded these 4 brands are from one another. So let's look and see how some of that branding impacts who purchases their products. So here what we have, this isn't ranked by total sales. What this is ranked by is the indexing of Gen Z to this product. So we know that Gen Z likes vapor pens. And what an index does is it tells us how much more Gen Z likes that brand than an average brand in the space. So things that over-index or are very high on the scale are brands that really appeal to people in Generation Z. In contrast, things that you see below that orange dotted line or to the left of that orange dotted line, those are things that under-index to Gen Z. And so those are brands that are less preferred by Gen Z and more preferred by other generations. So first, let's look at that Plug and Play and Dime Bag that I called out. We see both of these. Remember that branding? It was a very, very young branding. Plug and Play does even some flavored vapes. So we've got a very young branding on both of those. And we see both over appeal to Gen Z. The thing I want to point out here in particular, looking at Plug and Play, is how much more it over indexes to male Gen Z than female Gen Z. That's not quite the same for Dime Bag. While it does over index male, it's not quite as much as Plug and Play. Again, when we look at that branding, I think we can kind of figure out some of why based on how they're positioning their actual brands. Now let's look at those other 2 here, all the way down at the bottom. So these 2 brands very heavily under-index Gen Z, so less appealing to Gen Z. It doesn't mean that Gen Z doesn't buy them. It doesn't mean that they sell less. It just means these are products that appeal more to other generations. So there's ABX and Dosist. The first thing we notice is that both under-index Gen Z, but that they actually under-index male even more. So these are even less appealing to males in Gen Z. When we look at these brands are brands that tend to more index to Gen X or even baby boomers. And so I think as we think about that branding, we can kind of see in that branding, understand what it is. But the thing I want to talk about next is how, as a brand, we can position our messaging to also change the way that consumers maybe think about and purchase our products. So to do that, I want to introduce some research from McKinsey. So McKinsey does a lot of research on consumer packaged goods. And one of the ones that they did, it's linked in here, is a study on Gen Z. As part of that, they compared them to a lot of other generations, but based on the reasons and the reasons behind these consumption patterns and some of the behaviors the generations exhibit. So I'm not going to read this whole slide to you. The article is very long if you'd like to go and read it. But what I want to kind of pull from it to talk about next is this idea of how Gen Z chooses which products to consume. So the core of Gen Z is the idea of manifesting an individual identity. So consumption for them becomes a means of self-expression as opposed to, say, for example, buying or wearing a brand to fit in with the norms. Led by Gen Z and Millennials, consumers across generations are eager for more personalized brands, and they pay a premium for products that highlight their individuality. So this means these consumers are thinking about the things they buy as expressions of themselves. So brands looking to over-index to these consumers need to have a clear message about their positioning. The other generation I want to talk about is looking at those two generations just before them, the slightly older generations. So whereas Gen Z prefers to consume products as an expression of themselves, Millennials prefer to consume experiences. So if we think about Millennials, you can think about things like Burning Man, right? These are things that a lot of Millennials enjoyed. So experiences are a big deal to Millennials. Versus Gen X is a little bit different. One of their preferred reasons for consumption is as an expression of status. So luxury products tend to appeal more to people in Gen X. So what we're going to do next is see how this plays out into cannabis brands. So the first brand I want to talk about is Cannacraft's Farmer and the Felon. So they have a CSR message. CSR is short for corporate social responsibility. So this brand in particular, if you read kind of that bit down at the bottom, you can see that this brand positions itself as cannabis for change. This is a snip from their website. If we continued scrolling on their website, what you find is that they donate to the Last Prisoner Project. And in fact, there's a ticker of running statistics based on information from the Last Prisoner Project. So things about incarceration, money that's been donated. So this is a brand that stands for kind of that change, and they really put it out there. So as we think about that brand, what we find is that it very much over-indexes Gen Z. Remember, Gen Z likes to consume brands that express their own individual opinions and their own self-identity. Gen Z is a very inclusive generation. And so I think that that's one of the reasons we see this brand so heavily over-indexing in this group is the way that they've positioned themselves is to appeal to Gen Z. Let's take another brand. So here we have Candescent. This is another California brand. Candescent is a luxury brand. This is a snip from their website. If we were to scroll through their website, use of the word luxury or premium is everywhere. I mean, it's all over this website. It's true in their pricing too. So an eighth of cannabis in California generally costs like $35-ish, $33 to $36. An eighth of Candescent is going to bring in closer to the like mid to high 40s. So we see it as priced maybe 50% above average. So this is a very luxury brand. You can even see, like, look at that crystal ashtray, right? That might not necessarily be something that the average consumer has. So this is a super luxury brand. And remember, we learned that luxury is something that very much appeals to Gen X. So when we go and look at the data, what we find is this brand over-indexes to Generation X and actually baby boomers as well, which is what we expect. Remember that Gen Xers like to consume things that are an expression of status or luxury goods, sort of that like treat yourself idea that we see. And so this is another example of a brand kind of taking what each generation views as the reason they like to consume and integrating that into their own individual branding and positioning to drive that forward. So these are just two examples of brands. There's a whole lot of brands and a lot of people are using this type of research to package their products. It's very common for CPG goods to use this research to say what types of consumers they'd like to go after, and build those individual brand positioning strategies to better index to those types of brands. And what we wanted to do today was show how that's happening in the cannabis packaged goods space. So here's a few of our takeaways from today. First, Gen Z females were the fastest growing group. Females were growing faster in almost every group, but Gen Z females were the fastest growing group in cannabis. Younger generations saw those higher year-over-year growth rates than the older generations. And females saw higher growth rates than males across nearly all generations. And then when we think about why are we using demographic data in cannabis, So we still have a lot of ambiguity in this industry, a lot of restrictions, a lot of policy. There's a lot of difficulty marketing, whether it's running your Instagram account or even just the words that you can use on your packages. So knowing your customer is really vital. But understanding what those customers are looking for and making sure that your product is positioned to best appeal to the consumer group that you want is going to become critical. When we looked just before, we pointed out a handful of brands that were able to use their positioning to appeal to their target demographic group. Next, identifying this consumer behavior and product affinities helps you better target your brand, whether it is positioning your brand to better target or just understand your competitive set. So when we looked at Plug and Play and Dime Bag, those two are probably in a competitive set with one another. They probably aren't competing for customers with, say, ABX or Dosis, right? Those seemed like they were different customer types. And so as we define our competitive set of brands out there, understanding which consumers we appeal to and which consumers our competitors appeal to is pretty critical to knowing whether or not we're winning in the right spaces. And then finally, consumer behavior can vary from market to market. So Cooper brought that up. It's not all the same in each market, especially as we have very different brands still across each market, very different regulations. What we tend to see is that those trends don't always follow market to market. So I think it's pretty critical for the market you're in to understand the space that you have and how the other brands in there are competing for either your customers or the customers that maybe you're not going after. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Sai.
Thanks, Liz. Great job, and great job, Cooper. I guess just to kind of reiterate some of those last points, about applying demographics insights, it is absolutely critical to understand who's buying, what in your markets, being able to dig into gender, generation. It can really drive, product innovation, product positioning, how you market, just being mindful of it is pretty critical. We've got a lot of rich data here. Unfortunately, in this kind of format, we can't cover every brand and how they index. And if you have any specific questions or any specific needs around demographic data, we do offer what we call our analysts as a service, which enables us to help you answer whatever questions you might have with respect to market data. And in this context, particularly anything around demographics. So feel free to reach out and, we'll see if we can help you out with some of that stuff. It's pretty compelling information. And I think, there's a lot of learnings to be had when you start looking at this kind of data. So with that, I think we had a number of questions come through during the presentation. So why don't I hand it back to Liz and Cooper to take care of some of those.
Yeah, I'll start triaging through a few of those for us. So we had a fair amount of questions kind of getting more into the vapor pen market. So not just vapes in general, but maybe comparing disposables or all-in-ones to cartridges, or maybe looking at live resin versus distillate vapor pens. So none of that was in the presentation today. We definitely have all of that in our demographics data. And so I think what we'll try to do maybe as a follow-up over the next week or two is have like a little blog post where maybe, Cooper, you can help people out understanding the carts versus all-in-ones. If there's a particular group of customers that like those, it's not research I've done myself. And for live resin, we don't have that yet in our data, but that is something that should be coming out soon. So if you are a Headset subscriber, we have metadata dashboards now. It's a whole suite of analytic tools to help you kind of dig into not just this like high level category, subcategory, but really get into the attributes that make up a product. So within that, you can break things down by, say, strain and inhalables or flavors. You can look to see, multi-packs or single packs. You can see, is it a proprietary hardware type for vapor pens? But one of the things that's coming to that, hopefully in the next month or two, is a breakdown of the extraction type for vapor pens. So that's where we'll get into things like live resin and distillate in vapes. So going through some of these other questions. So we did have a lot of people asking if this will be sent out. Yes, it's being recorded. Yes, the deck will be available. We had a few questions about, I lost them. Oh, there we go. About what's driving the trends between men and women, men versus women spending. So there's a whole lot of things that we could dig into there. But I think that one of the biggest things we see is there's a lot more brands and a lot more products that tend to be marketed more toward women. So this is very true in consumer packaged goods, right? There are a lot of brands that we see that will be a more female or male oriented brand. And we're starting to see that in cannabis. So a decent brand to think about there is maybe Kikoko in California. It is a tea. It's a brand of tea bags. And they have very feminine branding, very feminine marketing. And we're starting to see a lot more brands like that pop up that maybe address this space that was left in the market by some of the legacy brands that tended to be a little more bare bones, like maybe just, you know, an eighth of buds in a glass jar. We're starting to see more of that branding, more of those like a lot of brands are starting to do, I call it effect-based marketing. So we saw with Dosis, right? We saw Relax, Sleep, Arouse, I think. So brands that do that tend to over-index female, and we saw that with Dosis as well. So I think that could be another thing, is that maybe what women are looking for is a little bit more of being guided toward what the product is, and a little bit less of kind of having to discover everything about every product or every strain. So I'll keep going. We have a question about the growth in the beverage industry of demographics. Cooper, I'm not sure, have you done any recent analysis on that? I know we have a beverage report we're going to do soon.
No, I haven't, but yeah, our next industry report is going to be all about beverages. So stay tuned in the next few weeks. I'll be writing up a deep dive into that category, and I'll definitely include some demographics trends in that.
Yeah, maybe make a note to get at least one good demographics trend in there. It seems like people are really interested.
And I did, Liz, I did just want to speak to one of the vapor pen questions. Just in general, I mean, like we can do some follow-up later and look at demographic trends within the different segments, but just so everybody has like a baseline, we see about 90% of total vape sales going to cartridges versus all-in-one disposables, or like a cartridge and a battery sold together. So when we're talking about vapor pens as a category, like in general, that's 90% sales to cartridges.
Yeah, good call out there, Cooper. Thank you. We have some questions about age groups. So do we have slides for, or the same charts for all the age groups, and how does branding affect age groups? So we do all of that. Most of that data is in Insights, or can be done with the analysts service that I was talking about. So all these things we could very easily break down and say, you know, which brands are more appealing to baby boomers, or which brands are more appealing to female Gen Xers. For sure, all totally possible, just not something we could do today. I think just with the few brands and single category we looked at, we already ran right up against our 30-minute mark. And so I think if we'd included all the age groups, our marketing team might not have been thrilled with the length of this webinar. So one of the questions we had is, how were brand preferences decided? And so the way that we defined brand preferences was that over-indexing. And what we used is that transactional data that Sai was talking about. So at Headset, we're connected to retailers across the United States and Canada, and we use that data to build market estimates and market projections. And so as part of that, what we can see, we can't see that I am Liz Connors. What we can see is that I am a 36-year-old female, and that I shop maybe once every 2 months, and that I over-index in beverages, because that's my category, and pre-rolls. So we can't tell who I am. We just kind of see what I do, what type of person I am, and how I shop over time. So we can come up with things like maybe we want to come up with a lazy consumer segment for someone like me. Pre-rolls and beverages. That is someone who does not want to roll her own joints, right? So these are things we can do with that data, and that's how we come up with those brand preferences, is we watch to see how people spend their money. So are you more likely to spend your money on brand X versus brand Y? And that would be where we derive those preferences. We think that it is the best way to get consumer preferences rather than just asking a consumer what they did. It's tough to remember what you did yesterday sometimes, let alone all the products you purchased over the last month or the last quarter. And I think at the same time, there's a lot of biases that come, whether it's an availability bias or whether it's a self-reflection bias when we self-report data. So we think at Headset the best is to use that transactional data, because it's difficult to forget or to misinterpret or to give an incorrect answer. Rather, we see exactly what happens based on your dollars, which really is the way we vote as people, right? We vote with our wallets. All right, so I have another question. As lockdowns and restrictions ease in 2021, how do you think 2020 trends will change? My gosh, is that anyone's question? You know, it was tough enough to forecast in 2020, and now forecasting 2021, I never thought it'd be worse than forecasting in 2020, and I was wrong. I think 2021 might be even harder. That said, I do think as people begin to be able to gather in groups, be outside more, I think what we'll see is some of the categories that maybe got hit a little bit harder, like pre-rolls, will probably rebound back up. Pre-rolls got hit pretty hard at the start of the pandemic. You know, if we think about having that joint and passing it around in a circle, that wasn't really something we were very much engaging in. I think that might take a while to rebound back where we're sharing, but getting together for that experience, I think probably is something that will start to rebound as vaccinations become more widely distributed. I think at the same time as people go back to work, any of the pain solutions might finally see their sales pop back up. So we don't, a lot of cannabis is used as pain alleviation. And when people are not at work, so you're not working like a 12-hour shift behind the bar, you're less likely to have pain. And so I think what we'll see is some of those brands that were more marketed toward pain, as people go back to work, we'll see those do a bit more. Let's see, I'm running out of time. I'm just going to answer a couple of these questions. Well, you know, I think I actually answered most of them. The last one I'm going to do is somebody asked about VapeGate, which is just, you know, feels so long ago, but that was the end of 2019 that we had all of the vape lung crisis. And it did really affect consumer trends. We saw vapor pens take a noticeable dive during that time. After a lot of the research came out that it was mostly illicit cartridges that were causing those issues, vapor pen sales tended to rebound, so it took a bit of time for them to steadily climb. Though we do see that Gen Z and Millennials were more likely to rebound back into those vapor pen segments than people older than them. So we might have turned some of the older generations away, but for the most part, we see vapor pens pretty good and rebounded in most of those younger consumer segments. And I think with that, we're probably just about at time, but we have all your questions. You can always reach out to us. So there's info@headset.io is an email address that you can reach out to and ask any of your questions, and we'll definitely have someone hook you up with an answer if we have an answer for sure. And I think with that, I might close out our webinar. Yeah. All right, I don't see any more questions piling in super quick. So thank you for coming today. The slides will be available. Hopefully those will be emailed out here in a little bit. And yeah, thanks everyone. See you next time.